Our talk today is by Dr. Sarthak Bagchi of the Ahmedabad University on the topic of Vyavastha for votes, analyzing the meanings of vote buying practices in Indian elections. Dr. Sarthak Bagchi is an assistant professor at the School of Arts and Sciences at Ahmedabad University. He worked as a doctoral research scholar at the Institute of Area Studies, Leiden University in the Netherlands, trained as a political scientist from the University of Hyderabad, where he did his MA and MPhil. He has been a keen observer of electoral politics, party systems, and state politics in India. His research interests lie in the topics of patronage politics, populism, electoral politics, state-society relations, party politics, informal politics, and comparative politics. He has also conducted research to understand politics in other countries such as Turkey, Indonesia, and the Netherlands. He also writes on politics for general audiences in The Wire, The Indian Express, and the Hindu Center for Politics and Public Policy. Dr. Bagchi has also worked as a journalist with a TV news channel NewsX before entering academics. And he has previously worked as a researcher with KITLV, the Royal Netherlands Institute of Southeast Asian and Caribbean Studies, Leiden, and Göttingen University, Germany. Let's welcome him with a huge round of applause. A brief introduction of his talk today. Vote buying is the distribution of rewards to individual or small groups of voters during elections in contingent exchange for their vote choice. Seen as an integral component among the large gamut of clientelistic practices, vote buying is considered undemocratic and illegal or even immoral by some standards, bringing forth a complex interface between money and morality. Vote buying arrangements by politicians in modern democracies are often seen to be highly transactional in nature, while at the same time, many scholars have found normative ideas of reciprocation and obligation being attached to the practice of buying and selling votes. When money alone is not seen as useful in buying votes, or when entrenched secret ballot systems like the ones prevalent in Indian elections make it difficult to monitor the compliance in vote buying deals, following questions are worth consideration. How do politicians engage in vote buying to make it an effective tool for electoral mobilization? And more importantly, why do politicians indulge in vote buying practices if it is not proving to be effective? We hope to find out the answers to these in the course of this seminar. Over to you, sir.
Okay. Thank you so much to Madhumita for inviting me here, and to the Dialogues team for arranging this talk here today. I mean, if I provide the answers, then I will have nothing to research about. So, so that's a small disclaimer that there might not be any conclusive answer to those questions, perhaps more exploration. But I'm very happy to be here today. It's, I mean, given the circumstances that we are living in, very few times that we can talk about our own research, and I'm happy to do that here, other than talking about other prevalent issues in the society right now. So this thing is actually, this paper is a part of the thesis. It's looking at vote buying and the idea of vote buying and the process, operationalization of vote buying, but also looking at it from a point of view of how it is organized and what does that organized way mean, or what are the perceptions that people have to this act of vote buying. And it is looking at this process of vote buying or the act of vote buying from two lenses, mainly from a politician's lens, which is the local level leaders who engage in vote buying, who engage in the transaction part, but also from the voters' point of view, who are the recipients or who are the actors who are involved in selling the votes, quote unquote. So this paper is basically drawn out from my fieldwork, my PhD fieldwork in Maharashtra and Bihar. So in these two states, I studied the assembly elections for my fieldwork, and I studied the assembly elections in two different constituencies in Bihar and Maharashtra, in 2014 Maharashtra elections as well as in 2015 Bihar elections. So these two constituencies, the names have been changed in this paper. One is called Samaipur, which is in Bihar, and the other one is called Kasardi, which is in Maharashtra. Because also when we do research on topics like vote buying or patronage politics or clientelistic politics, much of it is actually happening in a form of informal realm, or something which is also illegal kind of connotations. So which is why many respondents often do not respond if the identity has to be protected. So in that case, I had to change the names of the place as well as the respondents' names from what they were in original. But the study was basically also kind of given, the inspiration was also to use this method of ethnography to understand clientelism or to understand patronage politics was decided because somehow, given the illegality or even the informality of these practices, survey data has its own limitations in capturing the essence or capturing these various perceptions that somehow drive this kind of politics. So, which is why I used ethnographic methods to do this study. And I'll be reading out some excerpts from the paper, but also which is to give a way of flesh out the kind of voices from the field, so to speak. And the rest will be a part of the engagement with the audience. And of course, at the end, I would love to have more question and answers to perhaps get some more engagement on this topic, right? So the last day of campaigning in Samaipur saw frantic activities from both the Janata Dal United and the Bharatiya Janata Party campaign teams. And if I can, at that point in time, in 2015, when this paper is talking about, so both the JDU and the BJP were not in alliance. So they were competing parties, not unlike the current scenario, right? The exuberant motocreds from both the parties were covering ground all around the constituency till evening 5 o'clock, when the ban on campaigning, according to the Model Code of Conduct, was to be imposed. The evening brought many anxious minds for a brainstorming session at the courtyard of the local leader with whom this researcher was staying. Most of the talk going around at the meeting was regarding a certain Vyavastha, which needed to be done to ensure favorable polling the day after next. Responsibility of performing the Vyavastha was then allocated to each of the local leaders and campaign team members in their respective localities and to ascertain the vote support in their individual areas. The periphery of influence that each of them was asked to ascertain differed on the basis of their popularity in their locality and the degree of their participation in the campaign. The JDU local leader had one primary booth to monitor in his own panchayat. However, he was also asked to survey 2 additional booths in the vicinity as a mark of his seniority in the party and as a mark of his popularity in the locality. So this was the local leader whom I was shadowing during this study. As night fell upon the constituency, the murmurs and whispers of Vyavastha started becoming more frequent and continued to be the main political vocabulary till the day of polling. The brainstorming went well into the night, and it was also decided that one of the local leaders' relatives needed to make a casual visit the next morning. The visit was to the household of an influential Yadav man in an adjoining panchayat across the highway. I was told that the need for the visit had arisen due to a sudden demise of an elder in that family. Sensing an opportunity of imminent transaction as the circumstances provided, right at the cusp of elections, I accompanied the relative on this visit. Reaching the household, one could be betrayed by any signs of a loss in the family, which was surprising as the demise had occurred just the day before. We were asked to meet the head of the family at his shop, where we found the Yadav man going about his usual business. Spotting the visitors from a distance, he stopped what he was doing to come out of his shop and greet us. After a brief introduction, he sat comfortably in the confines of his shop and offered us tea. The introduction was to ascertain what am I doing here, what was I doing there, rather, sorry. Upon some routine inquiries regarding the mahal of the locality in view of the elections, the relative of the local leader took out a thick bundle of cash and offered it to the Yadav man. The money was supposed to be used for the cremation ceremonies and rituals that follow a death in any Hindu household. The Yadav man immediately took the bundle and stacked it carefully under the fold of his lungi and said gleefully, "Tension na lijiye, lalten ka law bujhne nahi denge." This means, do not worry, we will not let the light of the lantern, which is RJD's election symbol, to diminish, right? This was how money was exchanged just before the election, for what was acknowledged as a help to a fellow human being could easily be perceived as an act of vote buying or buying the vote, and thereby ensuring the electoral support of a particular political subject. The concept of vote buying is often captured and confused between what is acknowledged of the act and what is perceived of the act. Right. So, vote buying, as the abstract also mentions, is the distribution of rewards to individuals or small groups of voters during elections in contingent exchange for their vote choice. So, this is a very important definition as defined by Simeon Nichter, who studies vote buying and patronage politics in Brazilian context. And it is a distribution of rewards to individuals or small groups of people or voters during election in contingent exchange for their vote choice. So we have to really, when we talk about vote buying and other things, it often gets conflated with other forms of campaign spending, like say campaign buying and other things, which I will also engage with in this paper. But we have to understand that the selective allocation or selective distribution is a very key component of understanding how vote buying works, and it is also in contingent exchange for their vote choice. So that means it has to be contingent on the voting choice. That means it has to be ensured that the person who is actually getting the money will be behaving or will be voting in that in exchange for that money, right? But vote buying has been the gray zone of clientelistic politics because it is also considered undemocratic, illegal, and even immoral. But given its illegal and immoral nature, the secretive manner in which the vote buying is often carried out, it has always been a difficult process to document in political science literature. Gathering empirical data on vote buying has been a problem for researchers not only in India but across the developing world, where it is supposed to occur more prominently. Because the main theories of clientelism are basically indicating that vote buying and patronage politics or clientelistic politics occur more prevalent in societies which are poor. So where there will be more economic inequality or where there will be less economic growth, societies like those are more prevalent or more prone to vote buying tactics, which is a very generalized theory from the literature on clientelism, which looks at clientelism across Latin America, Southeast Asia, South Asia, and other places, right? But in India, if we look at, again, why the need for going into the ethnography is that if we look at the survey data suggests something else. The NES, which is the National Election Study, they consider this, they have been doing these studies of capturing elections and election data, large-scale election data across elections in India, right? So the NES in 2009 had this question about what do people perceive of vote buying and other similar activities happening in and around their locality, right? So this question was based to understand a kind of perception on vote buying in India. And the question was voters who think money or liquor is often given to buy votes in their locality, right? So in 2009, when this question was first used, the percentage of the total respondents who agreed with this idea that money or liquor is often given to buy votes in their locality, this percentage was 39.5%, right? And in the 2014 parliamentary elections, this percentage came down to 12%. And in 2015 Bihar Assembly election, when the same question was asked, this percentage fell even further down to 10.9%, like around 11%. So does that mean that is India going towards an economic growth, or is Bihar becoming rich, that clientelism or vote buying is actually decreasing? Certainly that will not be the case if anybody visits Bihar. But then there is something to do with the understanding of vote buying or the perception of vote buying that people have in their mind, or even admitting whether that is happening or not, right? Which is why it's also very important to kind of break down the kind of one-to-one transaction that vote buying is just a transactional thing, or vote buying is just a one-time interaction kind of exchange between a voter and a politician. But I think what I want to also harp on the fact is that it is something more, and which is why I use Vyavastha as the term to emphasize on the organization of vote buying as an act and as a political process, and not just as a transaction. The process of vote buying starts with identifying and marking the voters who will be targeted with various sorts of handouts like money, liquor, food, saris, gift items, and so on. This is followed by an increase in the intensity of visits paid by key members of the election campaign to meet such targeted voters over the duration of the campaign. Unlike the common perception of vote buying being just a one-time transaction of bribe exchanging hands between the elections, in the actual operationalization, brokers are seen as local level leaders or party functionaries, or even sometimes non-party functionaries, who act as a kind of a funnel between the state and the society and the politician. So brokers will be seen as like mid-level or intermediary players who represent the society outwards to the politician or to the state, and who represent the politician and the state downwards to the people. So they act like, to use Anirudh Krishna's words, they act like a funnel, basically, but like a two-way funnel, right? So these brokers and local leaders have to spend considerable amount of time interacting and consolidating the targeted voters who are likely to be bought for electoral support just before polling. This is often followed by selecting a few of the more vocal and assertive voters and making a subgroup from within the targeted group. It is this subgroup which is then tended to with some sort of Vyavastha. So the Yadav man, which I mentioned in the first example from the case in Samaipur, was actually this kind of a vocal and more assertive leader within this subgroup or subset, right? The Vyavastha in Samaipur for such subgroups involved repeated trips to Patna to meet the JDU candidate, who was a senior minister. These visits often ended up in overnight stays in hotels, complete with luxurious meals. And of course, the high point of the visit would be a face-to-face meeting with the candidate or the Vidhayak ji or the minister in this case, which would then translate into a magnified proximity to the candidate once the subgroup of voters would return back to the constituency, because these people are then coming back to the constituency to say that how close or how proximate they are to the candidate or to the minister now, which basically effectively means that they are in a position now to be able to solve problems or to be able to recommend people for sifarish, right? Which is a very important idea of how things work in everyday politics. The other man, as I said, who received a hefty amount, belong to this kind of a subgroup who are important cogs in the wheel of vote buying machinery before election, right? So this type of Vyavastha is an integral part of the vote buying process and helps in galvanizing the targeted group of voters by showing them a renewed proximity with the voters, with the powers that be within their own circle of people, and thus helps in forming a favorable influence and image of the candidate. The last state in the act is the final delivery of the money, liquor, or other such gift items, a day or two before the polling, and usually in the cover of darkness, which is also colloquially known as Qatl ki Raat or night of the kill. But the point that I'm trying to make here is vote buying is only seen often logically, or in journalism, this will be only seen as something which is only happening on the Qatl ki Raat. But the logic here goes much before that, and it starts much before the chain of events actually start before that, because when the stakes are high, or everybody is in the game in the constituency is also spending a lot of money, and when there are, again, the Indian context is such that there is enough evidence, or there is enough establishment at least, of the idea of a secret ballot, wherein monitoring, which I said, whether the first transaction is contingent on voting action or not, monitoring becomes a bit of a problem. In that case, people do want to ensure that the money that they are spending is effectively going to people who are already kind of strengthened or mobilized into that kind of an effective mobilization group, which is why the one-time transaction is not really an ideal thing for anybody, any politician to invest in, and which is why politicians depend a lot on this chain of brokers or chain of political leaders to carry out this entire enterprise of how vote buying happens before even the Qatl ki Raat approaches. A striking feature of the process of vote buying is timing of the transaction. Given the immorality and the illegality attached to the vote buying, most of this last minute transaction tends to occur discreetly and in the most secretive manner possible, sometimes systematically organized manner or in disorganized ways as well. Since the aim of the transaction during vote buying is to oblige the voters or clients into submitting their electoral choice to the buyers, the closer it is performed to the rate of polling, the better it is considered for patrons or politicians to hold the voter or client's obligation in return for the money. Qatl ki Raat, or night of the kill, just a day before the polling is slated to happen, becomes an important part of any political campaign taking place in India, as it is crucial window of time after the end of official campaigning and before the beginning of the polling. So when candidates and their election machines are known to go for the final push in order to mobilize the votes, right? However, as I just explained, that the mechanism happening before Qatl ki Raat is also equally important and equally important in making up the entire setup to the vote buying act. Now, when we come to the idea of monitoring compliance, and if in fact I can get back to a conversation which happened during or on the eve of this kind of a Qatl ki Raat, because also one good effect or good coincidence in that sense happened, that the Bihar elections were in different phases. So when I was studying the elections in Bihar, it came in about 5 phases, whereas Maharashtra, it was in 1 phase. So I could only be at one constituency on the polling day in my one constituency that I was studying. But in Bihar, because it was in multiple phases, I actually got the opportunity of doing multiple sites, adding multiple sites to the ethnography. And this discussion is coming from another constituency in which I went to take part and shadow some other local level leaders in that constituency. And during that, when I was sitting with a group of Kushwaha voters in a remote village in Mokama Assembly constituency, the election campaign was over and the model code of conduct was in force as the constituency went to polls the next day, right? So I was in the middle of what is known as the Qatl ki Raat, and there was this conversation happen, right? I asked my respondents if they were being persuaded or influenced in any manner by the vote buying tactics adopted by the political parties in their constituency. So I asked them that, are money and liquor distributed in your constituency during these days? Yes, the respondent one said, yes, very much. It is distributed in large amount. I asked, was it always distributed here in large amounts like this? No, not so much earlier, but this trend of distribution has started recently over the past few elections. Then I said, do you get obliged then if you are given money or, from the person who's distributing these things? Yes, they try to influence us and they try to oblige us, especially the young boys. But we tell them that, khao piyo noch kar, vote karo soch ke, right? So this is something which is there. I mean, this came to define the way voters also look at khao piyo noch kar, vote karo soch kar. And this is not completely an illegitimate thing to do or say. Studies from Philippines, Thailand, from Brazil are also showing that voters have a sense of right or attach a sense of right to this vote buying money or the money or the bribe that or the gift that are offered for vote buying. There are evidences of people in Philippines actually looking at it as a punishment money, because they think that since in the last 5 years politicians have not served us, this is the time that we can punish them for not coming to the constituency or not visiting the village. So they are treating this as a punishment money. Then in Thailand, there are many instances in which villagers refuse to vote unless the politicians send them buses or rickshaws or the local, arrange for transport to take them to the polling booths, right? Similarly, in Brazil also, voters do look at these networks of brokers or this kind of thing not only as a kind of a bribe or illegal, but looking at them as problem-solving networks, and they expect that when they reach or when they're voting, the problems will be solved. So the idea that this is something to be seen as an illegal or immoral thing is also, we are seeing that a lot of reflection is actually needed on whether this thing is so immoral at all or not, right? Or this is becoming a sense of a right as a matter of right. So, but then the idea, so this establishes that kind of how it is difficult for politicians and local level leaders also to monitor whether the particular section or the particular individual whom you are bribing will be voting for you or not. Which is why, again, coming back to the Vyavastha, it is the Vyavastha and getting into that idea of the network which then helps them in establishing whether the money that they're spending in the network is effective or not, right? But then people still do it, right? It is very prevalent. Vote buying, we see that vote buying is a very important and very real part of Indian elections, right? And despite people saying that khao piyo noch kar and vote karo soch kar, but politicians are not then shying away from using large amounts of money, spending large amounts of money into the vote buying. A book by former Chief Election Commissioner S.Y. Qureshi on called The Great Indian Elections actually has listed out over 40 such innovative methods which politicians and their campaign teams use to distribute cash before elections, right? And one of the main or most coveted models, if I can say that word, use that word, coveted models, is the Tirumangalam formula, right? Which became a precedent or a benchmark of sorts in the organizational managing of vote buying due to its innovative technique that the DMK used of placing the bribe money in the morning newspapers into every household. Right, and it actually this model even finds mention in the US cables leak by the WikiLeaks. So, however, the stress in this model was on the distribution part of vote buying and not so much on the obligation part, as one of the DMK functionaries involved in the campaign admitted in the reported cable that how giving bribes to every voter wasted money on committed anti-DMK voters, but conceded that it was an effective way to ensure that the cash reached every potential persuadable voter. So the idea is that you are ensuring, that there will be some people who will be anti and on whom the money will be wasted, but at least the idea is to expand the spread and to widen the spread to reach every potential persuadable voter, right? Which again, if the money is not so much prevalent, like in say Bihar elections or in other states where so much money like DMK and AIADMK will not be available, that is when the networks or the broker networks come into place, or this Vyavastha comes into place to expand the reach to reach out to every persuadable potential voter, right? But then why is vote buying so necessary, right? Or why is it that we know that it is happening, and we know that it is happening despite the problems that are there? Vote buying is often used by politicians as a last-minute resort, not just to ensure victory, but rather to ensure a non-defeat. And this is one thing that I asked politicians whom I was studying, that if there is no guarantee or there is no return of your investment, then why is it still happening? Why are you still engaging in it? So over several discussions with the candidates, it came out that it was not difficult to see through that vote buying is indeed quite pervasive and predominant, a technique of influencing and sometimes mobilizing voters in the run-up to the polling day. However, there is hardly any certainty of ensuring votes polled in favor of one candidate for the money that he spends in buying, right? So then why does a candidate even bother spending money in vote buying instead of investing it in more feasible ways of election campaigning, which would at least entail a surety in return? The answer was actually can be summarized in one of the statements that a Congress candidate in Kasardi made, that spending money in vote buying is not a sufficient condition to win the election, but a necessary condition to stay in the fight. So it so happens that if everybody in the election or in the electoral market, so to speak, is spending, then one has to spend the minimum amount of money required to stay in the fight. It is not about with an expectation of winning, but it is about with the expectation of becoming a serious contender or a serious or a fight contester who is actually giving a fight, right? By at least matching up to the minimum amounts of money being spent in the electoral fray. Buying votes, therefore, guarantees a sort of recall value in the minds of voters, even if it does not translate into an electoral victory. For candidates who keep contesting in the same constituency and who take politics as a vocation, this recall value certainly helps in keeping them politically active in the region and for keeping their politics alive, which is Rajniti ko zinda rakhna, which is what local leaders in Samaipur told me, right? So then again, now if we look at how vote buying is also sometimes mixed, or this continuum can be mixed into different parts, like not only the last transaction between the voter and the politician or the voter and the broker, but there are different ways. There will be ways of collective vote buying or buying influence or campaign buyout, which is also some work, new work is emerging in that direction of how vote buying is different from campaign buyout. Simon Chauchard has some interesting work on this coming out from Bombay, and both of us happen to be studying same elections in 2014 in Maharashtra assembly elections, and he also talks about this in this book called Cost of Democracy, right, edited by Devesh Kapoor and Milan Vaishnav. So how do politicians actually do this, and how does vote buying as well as the campaign buying happen? So if I can just go back to the field again, in Kasardi, the murmurs of vote buying and exchange of cash from leaders of different parties, political parties, to groups of voters started gaining ground with the rise in the intensity of election campaign. One of the brokers of the Congress candidate I met in the final stages of the election campaign pointed out to the cost of offering t-shirts with the name of the candidates to around 400 young boys and girls in his village panchayat that he had to bear from his own pocket. So this, we are actually going back into the former stages of the campaign from the last day. So the introduction started from the last day of the campaign, and now we are going back into a little bit of traveling into the campaign, into the thick of the campaign. So he had to bear from his own pocket, and then he said that the rival party has already started distributing these t-shirts in other villages, and many youngsters have come and asked me for them in my village. If I don't order them now, it might get too late. So I just went ahead, paid for them from my own pocket now. The youth today, he says, demands these things. We always have to keep giving them incentives in order to oblige them to attend our rallies and campaign meetings. Otherwise, they will run off to the better offer. So I always have to offer one up from my rivals. And this is how the local leaders are competing. The Congress campaigners, as well as those campaigning for Kaka, who was the independent candidate in the constituency in Maharashtra, to them, also seemed worried with the financial might of the BJP candidate, who according to them had substantial reserves of cash meant just for buying votes before elections. Apart from the monetary threat, the BJP candidate was also very aggressively distributing t-shirts and other campaign goods with his branding and that of Prime Minister Modi in several villages across Kasardi. Both the rival campaign teams expressed their difficulty in matching up to the BJP candidate's capacity to spend. While there is not much clarity as to the obligation that t-shirts or campaign propaganda goods like wristbands, caps and other paraphernalia holds in the mind of voters, however, it certainly emerges that the term of obligation, which are often enforced on the voters, are not unidirectional in flow and are often set by the voters themselves and are highly competitive. While there was no guarantee of obliging voters by distributing t-shirts and other campaign merchandise, not distributing them certainly ran the risk of becoming unfavorable or non-popular among the voters. During the hectic campaign in both Samaipur and Kasardi, I came across several young political workers who were associating with different candidates on a daily basis upon the payment of daily allowances and petrol for their motorcycles. Usually, these young workers were gathered and arranged by local leaders with a person in charge of assembling them every day and explaining them the routes and roles of their daily campaigning. The BJP campaigns, I've talked about this in another article as well, use these tactics with more success as it could draw more young workers into its fold with a pull factor of their leader, Modi, right? In Kasardi, and you have seen that in every election there is this BJP bike rally, which is a very integral part of BJP vote canvassing. In every constituency, you will see that, the bike rallies are a very integral part of how BJP canvasses. In Kasardi, almost 2 weeks before polling, all the restaurants and hotels seemed to be packed with customers arriving in for lunches and dinners. This sudden and rather drastic increase in the footfalls of customers in the hotels was very evident, especially in the hotel and restaurants lined along the main highways. Right? Inquiries in this regard led to the admission by one hotel owner that this being a form of payment for services and votes in the wake of the election. Almost every campaign team was running accounts in many of these hotels across the constituency, where people could go, name the politician, and enjoy a meal without having to pay for them. Right? They just had to name the politician or the local leader, and then it would be written in his account. And most of these, I'm afraid, most of these local leaders were men. And at least in terms of vote buying, I'm yet to come across women local leaders who are engaging or enterprising or organizing this kind of Vyavastha, right? But the possibility of many voters enjoying a free meal also could not be ruled out, as one of the restaurant owners suggested. So what then are the mechanisms in place for politicians to check that only their supporters enjoy the free meals on offer, so that they can in exchange enjoy their electoral support? Unfortunately, there are no such mechanisms which credible enough to efficiently discriminate or make the difference. So this is the larger issue of also monitoring the compliance, and a crucial stage of any clientelistic exchange relationship is that you are able to monitor the actions or monitor compliance to the deal that has already been sealed. The patron must be able to monitor the compliance of his or her clients, so that to ensure that the money spent in buying votes actually buys the votes or bring the votes. One way of checking this compliance, I was told in Maharashtra and Bihar that by some of the local leaders, that use of the public sphere, right? Since campaigns in India campaign politics is a very public event, right? And every move of the politician and his campaign team is out in the public view, right? It's a kind of a performance in the public realm, more like the spectacle of elections. So to be seen in one party's campaigns brings with it the identity of attachment with the politics of that particular political party or that particular personality. Many of these workers and voters often went to the restaurants in groups, and once seen with a certain group in the time of election campaign, a person then tends to get identified or marked as a member of that group. In Maharashtra, these are also called gut. So every person or a faction, like Paul Brass has talked about that. So every person who is attached to one gut or a group or a faction tends to get identified or marked with that kind of a group, right? Local leaders and brokers told me that they relied on this principle of recognition in the public sphere for noting down their supporters, and that they usually ascertained their support as polling dates approached. Again, this is also a part of that Vyavastha. Apart from the free meals, many of the candidates in both Bihar and Maharashtra had accounts running with one or two petrol pumps in the constituencies, from where campaign workers could get a regular supply of free fuel for the duration of the campaign. Unlike the free meal, this freebie of the free fuel was a little more organized and strictly monitored. As I was told, that petrol pumps had a list of vehicle numbers provided to them, and only those vehicles could be refueled free of cost. Without any guess, both the fuel and the food bills would reach into several lakhs rupees, consisted of important part of the campaign expenses by most of the candidates. This is also related to the idea of generosity as a candidate, and which also something that which is not a new thing. It has been talked about from ancient Roman times. Of if you read Cicero, and he talks about how to win an election, and one of the main things that Cicero talks about is the leader has to appear generous, or like a benefactor or a data. So this idea of giving or generously giving or showering money is linked to that idea. And definitely then spending rises during the election campaigns for both campaign buying as well as for vote buying. By these actions of providing for people directly working for him and people who are expected supporters, candidates, or potential persuadable voters, like I said, the the candidates are performing the role of being the benefactor who is overtly generous and not just a dominating patron with an inequality of resources or with an increasingly high amount of resources, right? How am I doing on time? 15 minutes. Okay. Great. And so when we look at the campaign buying or vote buying, so vote buying is also seen as something which is a more personal kind of a action or a personal kind of an exchange. Whereas campaign buying is something which is, as I said, happens in the public sphere, right? Selling of votes and vote buying in terms of cash transactions generally occurs. Oh, okay. Okay, sorry. Okay, I thought. Okay. So, and vote buying happens in this kind of a transaction happens usually in a more secrecy and a more kind of, cover of darkness, like I was saying. So for voters who sell their votes, it often becomes more of an individual act rather than a group activity. Individual transactions generally end up with a limited distribution of resources, say 1,000 rupees for each vote, or even 5,000 like the Tiruvangalam model suggested, or whatever the prevalent rates of votes that are decided in the constituency, right? And also it varies from election to election. Like for Lok Sabha, the rates will be different. For Vidhan Sabha, the rates are different. And any guesses where is the maximum amount of money spent for each vote? Anybody can guess? No. At which level of election? Whether it is at the Lok Sabha parliamentary election, or whether it is at the assembly election, or whether it is at another level. Yeah, that's true. So the panchayat level election, and that is when the costs of each individual vote goes up very highly. Why? Because of course panchayats are very closely knit, and there is the efficiency is there that of monitoring compliance, and the looser the constituency gets, the more spread out, and that's when the value of the vote depreciates. However, collective bargains by a group of voters not only gives them more bargaining power vis-a-vis the patrons or the candidates, but also helps to a certain extent in removing the stigma attached to the process of vote buying or the kind of immorality that is attached to it, right? Such collective bargains are often seen through the aegis of resident welfare associations in urban areas or caste associations in semi-urban areas or rural areas, which often come together collectively to pressure a patron to deliver goods, often on a preferential basis. One of the key members in Kasadi of the Congress leader told me that many Yuva mandals in the urban area did indulge in tough negotiations with the campaign team to be paid accordingly for their electoral support. The electoral support translated into not just voting in favor of candidate or on the polling day, but also a bunch of extended activities like mobilizing voters in the neighborhood for rallies and election meetings and to actively participate in the campaign. Apart from campaigning, every member of the mandal also had the responsibility of getting at least 4 to 5 voters, either from immediate or extended family or locality. So the Yuva mandals, much like the social clubs, were influential forces in these neighborhoods and generally attracted a lot of youth membership in their fold, varying in its size from 50 members to in a small mandal to even 4 to 500 members in a bigger mandal. So this is not the Mandal Commission Mandal, but this is a very different kind of a Yuva or youth groups or youth club, which are called Yuva Mandals in Maharashtra. Apart from indulging in everyday politics of political society, as illustrated by Partha Chatterjee, these kind of mandals are very similar to the nature of clubs, or which operate in para level in Kolkata or in other areas. These mandals organize Durga Puja, Ganesh Puja, and Navratri celebrations in their neighborhoods. And given the occurrence of the assembly election just after the end of the puja, made it a ripe time for them to negotiate and bargain lucrative donations from politicians for their respective puja pandals in return for their electoral support. The political support was on offer for the highest bidder to buy. The money offered not only ensured that 50 to 100 votes of the members of the mandal, but also an additional 150 to 200 votes for their immediate and distant families in the locality. The active participation of these youth mandal members in the campaign team was an additional bonus for the candidate's campaign, helping him in generating the much needed hawa, or the momentum, right, in his favor. One of the local leaders engaging in the constant negotiations with these mandals on behalf of his campaign team called it the politics of mandal bundle. That is, to approach each mandal with a bundle of cash. This was how votes were offered for selling, and this was how votes were bought. So this can also be seen as a clear case of voters creating a pressure on one patron to provide more, as they threaten the existing patron with switching alliances to the new patron who is waiting in the wings. While many scholars believe that in many places, clientelistic exchange works by instilling the fear of being cut off from the supply of benefits among the clients, which is why it is seen as undemocratic, right? But like Susan Stokes has talked about that. However, in India, this example is also providing an alternative idea that clients are using their collective power to instill a fear among the patrons of their vote banks shifting to other parties, and thereby making the patrons respond to the situation by increasing the scope of the largest being exchanges in the relationship. So this is how an organized selling of votes in collective terms gives rise to a sort of a competitive clientelism. And why this idea of competitive clientelism is important is this is a major shift or a big transformation that we see in how clientelistic politics has come to be practiced in the Indian context. And if you look at how M.N. Srinivas mentions it, of the idea of vote banks or idea of vote buying in the Congress patronage system, was that there used to be this one patron who would be a factional leader or who would be a caste leader, and who would often be this kind of a nirvirod mukhya, unopposed mukhya, and they would be approached by the politicians to deliver votes on command, right? And that created the entire network or the patronage structure. And these patronage structures were based on hierarchy, with a kind of a supplicant or a kind of a suppressed client without any agency. But we see that this is very different from what is happening today in terms of rural as well as in urban areas, where the clients are actually also showing that there is the idea that there is a secrecy of ballot, that monitoring compliance is difficult if not impossible. Then there is the pressure on the politicians to match up to the standards of different bidders. There are more power centers available within the constituency also. The local level leaders through decentralization have also got access to different levels of power. So all the power is not with the MLA or the Vidhayak ji, but even the Mukhia has some power now. In Bihar, it is clearly a case to be seen how Mukhia in fact actually has more direct funds at hand than the MLA. So these things, these shift in dimensions are also changing or alternating the manner in which client-patron interactions have happened. And vote buying through this lens of Vyavastha is a sign of, or an attempt to capture those kind of changes or those kind of transformations happening in the realm of clientelistic politics. And I'll just end here. Just 2 minutes. So the reiteration of Vyavastha, which dominated the political vocabulary of Samaipur and Kasadi in the pre-polling period, is also indicative of vote buying activities going on in the constituency just before votes are polled. So elections in India, which are often seen through ritualistic and sacred, like Mukulika Banerjee's ideas of perceptions, are not only about upholding certain rights-based universal values of equal franchise, but also about certain pragmatic negotiations and bargainings which have an overbearing effect on those sacred democratic rights. vote buying or Vyavastha, as I encountered it in practice in Samaipur and Kasadi, is an important part of this pragmatic side of the story. It also indicates the fact that although vote buying as an act is generally carried out immediately before the polling day or the night before, but vote buying as a performative spectacle through the means of Vyavastha begins a bit earlier in the campaign and helps in building the momentum of an election campaign, right? So the idea is that this is not to deny that vote buying is not happening or vote buying is can be curtailed, because this is this is a reality. This is a stark reality of how vote buying actually happens, and the role of money and the influence of money in electoral politics happens. Now, whether we call it vote buying to understand it more clearly as a concept or as a flawed concept that does not apply to what is happening in Indian case, or it is something we have a new concept of, say, campaign buying, and then how do we evaluate that? Perhaps these are large, and what kind of effects or what kind of implications does it have on democratic rights and democratic functioning in the entire electoral framework? I think these are important questions to understand, because what surveys till now attempt to do is capture the extent of or the magnitude of vote buying, how it happens. But what needs to be understood is basically, or research is the character or the meanings or the perceptions of vote buying, and then probably we will understand why is it happening. So vote buying in that sense, or the ability or the influence of money or role of money in Indian elections, is not so much suppressing the analytical abilities or agency of the voters by making them kind of a suppressed client, but it's actually suppressing another form of a democratic right, which is the right to participate in election or the right to contest in election. What we now see is that people, to be a serious contender, one needs to have that amount of network or that amount of money, and not everybody can contest elections successfully, which is also a very cause of concern, because now this links to the idea that probably also may be discussed in the conference that Mona will be putting up in February, how it is also barring a lot of young people from entering politics. And I think that is also something which can be, needs to be seen from this lens of vote buying and campaign buying and the role of money, because many young people are not able to contest elections or to become serious contenders in elections because of their inability to match these hefty amounts of vote buying or campaign buying. So it is not necessarily infringing on a democratic right of having an autonomy of choice for the voter, but it is it is hampering or determining the kind of candidates that we end up choosing. And I think that is something to look forward to for further research, right? So thank you. With that, I will invite your questions.